Welcome to the final chapter of part 2 of the PhD on the Christology of Rudolf Steiner. The 3 chapters have been working with I suppose we could call the 3 arenas of Christology, the pre-existence of Christ, the incarnation stories, and what we know about them and how we can read them esoterically. And now in chapter 7, we look at Steiner's ideas about what is known in the academy as soteriology, eschatology, and the pleroma of Christ. Now, before you leave, let's work out what those 3 words mean. So, soteriology is about how we understand salvation or redemption to having been taken place. Eschatology is about the last things or the end of history or the completion of evolution, depending which way you want to read it. And the pleroma is about completing the incomplete. Pleroma means the fulfillment or the fullness of Christ. So these are all the sort of, how does the Christ impulse or the mystery of Golgotha or the resurrection work on through history? And can we find a way to relate to that practically? And can we find a way to relate to that classically? Can we find a way to relate to that esoterically from a Steiner point of view? I actually just wanted to read to start with the start of this chapter, because I found trying to summarize it is really difficult. So I'm just going to read it. Steiner's insights into the ongoing future work of Christ since Pentecost are where I most experience the relevance and meaning of his ideas, complexity, and esoteric nature. Understanding the effects of Christ's deed made a deeper working together between the human being and Christ in evolution evident. In understanding Steiner's ideas of salvation, eschatology, and the fullness of Christ in the world, I have been able to understand how my endeavors of faith and morality participate in the evolution of the world. For me, it is an inner journey from relying on external authority and faith in doctrines for my understanding and moral action, to an experience of the direct consequences of Christ's deed for my life. I am moving from passively letting Christ's death and resurrection be enough for my atonement to realizing the fulfillment of the deed of salvation as a collaboration between Christ and the human being's love for each other. In the apocalyptic words on the Mount of Olives, Christ formulated as, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers or sisters of mine, you did to me." That's in Matthew 25. Christ's deed became a source for my engagement with others, knowing that what I do to each human being affects the work of redemption that has become an inner personal source for moral impulses. Rather than having an externally sourced moral maxim, I could, through understanding these intricacies of the effects of Christ upon our humanity, find my own moral sources within my soul. Steiner agrees with traditional Christology that the manifestation of these new forces in Christ was termed the last or second Adam, created in the image of the invisible God, and is the creative agent and final goal of creation. So Paul, Corinthians, first letter of Corinthians or Colossians. This second Adam is an entirely new being created in the course of evolution, and as the firstborn of creation, is not formed of earth and dust as the first Adam. Again, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. By progression, Steiner would agree with the church father Irenaeus that the Virgin Mary is the second or last Eve. Throughout the rest of evolution, the human being will collaborate through their capacities to love one another with the Christ and Mary forces in themselves, so that we bear the image of the heavenly human. So in relation to the individual human being, to the resurrected Christ Jesus and the Virgin Mary, as the last Adam and the last Eve are critical to the ongoing evolution of humanity and the universal human archetype in the world. Through the resurrection, something new has come into the world, which each of us are invited to access and develop within ourselves. I thought that was a really nice summary of the whole chapter, really. So let's try and break down these three words. So the teachings on salvation, we can see that there is in the sort of teachings of how the human being is restored from the separation from God through grace and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So he points out, Steiner points out, that in the 12th chapter of the Gospel of John is a vital transition between the first and second parts of the narrative. And we hear that Christ is speaking of the nature of his death. And so we come to the possibility of another theology of atonement, we call it. So the three normal classic models of atonement are ransom, substitution, and a model for moral behavior. And Gail R. O'Day, in her Interpreter's Bible contribution, How Jesus Interprets His Death, in chapter 12, says, Jesus' death is described as both necessary and life-giving, because as a result of it, community is formed. The discipleship teachings in verses 25 and 26, which in the synoptic traditions define discipleship exclusively as taking up one's cross, instead define discipleship as serving Jesus and make clear that the goal of such service is restored relationship with God and Jesus. This is a really critical point for the rest of our understandings. The Passion prediction in 1232 also focuses on relationship, that through Jesus' death, all people will be drawn to him. Finally, in the concluding of the chapter, community is described as becoming children of the light. So Steiner talks about the Gospel of John as being the gospel of I am the light of the world, and the healing of the blind man is the awakening of the light in the human being as promised in the prologue. And this is a really critical understanding of what the the theology of atonement is about. Is we've been through grace, through Christ's death, a kind of reconciliation has taken place, and our salvation, Paul says, comes through faith. So Paul uses faith and belief in the present tense. Yeah. But Steiner uses the word faith and belief as activities of cognition and knowing, and that has become a source of loving one's neighbor. This insight changed my understanding from following a teaching to taking responsibility for the consequences of my actions, which I could no longer escape through the authority of just through confession through the church. So the responsibility for the consequences of my action, in other words, for a sense of a moral responsibility. Yeah. So how do we go with this? How are we saved? So Paul says through faith. James adds, that without works, faith is empty. So that's a real step within the Bible. My addition to that through this has been that through understanding how this event of Golgotha has transformed the human constitution, has placed the Christ impulse for moral development within us, and understanding how that works, we can say that, the way we get to salvation is through faith, works, and understanding. I think Steiner would add that last part. It might be implicit actually within the Bible, but yeah, this thing of, as an individual, I need to understand the consequences of my works and understand the moral relationship to correcting that rather than externalizing that. So how do we keep going with that? So it comes down to the fact that in the soteriology, so Steiner speaks of the spiritual economy. So we can see that something was inscripted into the human soul, into what Steiner would call the thinking, the feeling, the willing, into our constitution. And as human beings, we have to grow that ourselves individually. So it's not just we've been given something that is fulfilled within ourselves, but the fulfillment, the pleroma, the fulfillment of Christ comes because I go through an individual process. So, for example, the content of the Bhagavad Gita is that the moral ennoblement through various forms of yoga, Christ transforms this teaching into the new commandment of loving one another. So he takes the approach, he gives us incredible lecture cycle that is, if anyone is wanting to read stuff on the background, it's called A Spiritual Foundation of Morality with Francis of Assisi and the Christ Impulse. And he says that we need to transform the four Platonic virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice into the three Pauline or theological virtues of faith, love, and hope. So that is part of how we found the salvation in cooperation between the human being and Christ, is that these gestures of faith, love, and hope have been placed in us through the mystery of Golgotha, through Christ's work within the Jesus individual. And then we bring in the Mary part into that as well. But the human being now must, in a similar way to the Buddha path, where each of us now actually have to fulfill the Eightfold Path within ourselves. We can't rely on the fact that Buddha did it. We are being given it as a pathway of developing compassion. Through Christ, we have to also then see that we have to do that as well. So Steiner, in that spiritual foundation of morality, says the future evolution of humanity will take place through the cooperation of human moral impulses with the Christ impulse. Looking towards the future, we see humanity as a great organic structure. The human beings are able to integrate their actions into this organism, and through their actions created sheaves, humanity will have prepared in the course of Earth's evolution the foundation for a mighty community which can be thoroughly permeated by the Christ impulse. So we sort of, if we go back in the thesis, the difference between Christ as a being that works for our humanity in evolution, Christ as an objective being who brought about an event in the history through the death and resurrection. But then also within us, we have the Christ impulse. So the impulse within us to act in a Christian fashion. So we then, through that impulse, can begin to transform the three Platonic virtues. Yeah. Already well established. So those are part of how we can go into this part of the spiritual economy. Something's actually been put into place into the earth, into the human being, which now needs to grow, basically through our own moral impulses to love. So that might be a good starting point to understand the soteriology. So a person who has a foundation of faith in the goodness of the human soul and in the love of human nature can do no other than say, what arises from the combination of the original goodness of the human soul and the act of love in us justifies a perspective of the future wherein every soul, no matter how far it has fallen from spiritual heights, may be led back again to these heights. That's a really interesting way of looking at this whole idea of the theology of salvation, is that it's not, yes, there's a grace given to us through the death and resurrection of Christ, and our faith is an active part of that, but works through understanding is how that salvation really comes to fruition in each of us. And he then brings how a process, he describes a process on how a human being can go about this on hand of the story of Francis of Assisi. So he talks about how Francis of Assisi was a warrior. He's a strong impulse of courage within himself, but he was, struck off his horse and was told that he needed to go home and fight the battle within himself to transform his forces of courage within himself. And he goes home and in his own community, in his own household with his father, goes through a huge inner battle where these warrior class forces of the warrior are transformed into love. And that becomes his capacity to heal. And this is a kind of a gesture that each of us need to do, is take the outer battle of the world into ourselves and build these pictures of faith, love, and hope as ways of doing that. So as the capacities given to the human being become more robust and more present in individuals, so will they be able to express their works in the world through faith, love, and hope. Profoundly universal humanizing capacities have been graced to the human being through our faith, which is the faith in the knowledge of how the spiritual world works. We participate in the ongoing works of love, which is the foundation of hope for the future human community born of the children of light. Is a quick summary of that. So yeah, opening up the theology of salvation to a process rather than a complete works. As I said, Matthew Fox sort of opened that idea for me a long time ago in his book Original Blessing, where he said, we shouldn't just see the Bible story as a full redemption model, but we should talk about this thing of original blessing, that we've been blessed so that we can bless. So we've been graced, we've been blessed, but now we need to learn how to, out of that, learn how to bless and heal and, be Christians. So we go to the second part of the chapter on the eschatology, on the end of history. So the spiritual economy is that the essence of the spiritual world is changed through our becoming. Now that's might be a little confronting for classic theology, that we sort of think the spiritual world is perfect, it's come to us and we've been made perfect. But in many ways, our actions ramify upon the spiritual world. So for example, in Ephesians 6 or Revelation 12, we take into account this idea that the end of history, the fulfillment of evolution, the final outcome of evolution is reliant upon our deed, our becoming. So this ongoing cooperation between humanity and Christ is a very important aspect of the eschatology. And that also includes in the final outcome. So we have to look at the whole idea of evil. How do we actually engage in our becoming, in our moral deeds with what we would call the evil forces, or the unconstructive deeds of other people? How do we actually cooperate with that way? And so we have to sort of see how the evil is becoming continually stronger in the inner life of human beings. And so we need to address somehow in a very practical way that there is a possibility that these evil forces can be transformed and redeemed, not just excommunicated, overcome. So, the whole Star Wars, even the hero's journey, where we sort of do away with the evil, but how do we actually include the evil and redeem it is a huge process of the Manichaean kind of Christianity that Steiner brings in as well. But we've been given the capacity at the Garden of Eden to know the powers of evil in such a way that a beginning of redemption becomes possible. And I sort of say these capacities now in the eschatology need to be grown. How do we learn to grow the mystery of Golgotha? We could say, what are the hallmarks of what's being given to the human being in salvation? So how does How does the soteriology, the salvific deed in us become a process towards fulfilling history? And I've isolated 3 words: restoration, redemption, and transformation aspects of Christ's deed. So the first is a restorative quality, and is the return of the pure human soul through the birth of the Nathan soul. So the Luke story. So we were talking about earlier that there was this return of the pure human soul that had been kept back at the fall. This is a restoration quality within every human being. So there's a restorative quality where the tree of life comes back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The second redemptive quality is a redemption, and we could call it a rescue job, to rescue humankind from individual egocentric soul qualities. So something's been placed in us that if we develop, we can overcome the egocentric qualities of our soul that would darken our sort of moral choices. We could say darken might not be the right word for that. So, and Steiner, in this sense, talks about the intellectual fall of humanity. So there's a point where he talks about the incarnation of the light, the birth of the light, the logos, the word, and that's slowly incarnated in all these pre-earthly deeds of Christ. But now it's also going right down into the personality in Jesus of Nazareth, but also as we've come further than 2,000 years ago, there's also a sort of an intellectual fall where we have become more and more animated, or I suppose connected with the idea. He says our intelligence has become more and more cold, freezing, and detached from anything of heart and soul. Our intellect is formed into an automatic process where thinking becomes separated from experience, our heart, and the life of the will. And through Christ, the intellect is connected to love and interest concerning the outer world, and it does not become or remain in the service of self-love. So that's a Christ impulse in us, is to make sure our intelligence is able to get beyond serving the egotism and the egocentrism of the individual. And then the third quality of the mystery of Golgotha is this is the idea of transformation. So the transformative quality of this. So the redemption of thinking. Sorry, I just need to get back to where I was before. Where have I gone? So we need to look at this transformative quality of the mystery of Golgotha, where the human being can engender spiritual thoughts. So that's the redemption of thinking. That's the true traditional aspects of being created in the image of God. That's the restoration. So we are created in the image and in the likeness. So the restoration is where we've been created in the image of God, the second Adam, and the likeness of God, which is the redemption, has a third aspect of being created in the likeness of Christ. So in Genesis, we are created in the image and the likeness of God, and now we are also created in the likeness of Christ, which is a transformative deed. And therefore, the further course of evolution, or the eschatological part of the human being, is to become responsible for christening the ethical life. So that's the transformative. Again, he brings it back to the thinking, the indwelling of wisdom into the light of the human being. All these aspects keep repeating themselves through this chapter. I then allude to the fact that the mystery of Golgotha, this is possibly now heading into the esoteric side of this chapter, which is really looking at, we had the 3 pre-earthly deeds of Christ and Jesus of Nazareth, or the Nathan soul in chapter 5, in the pre-earthly deeds. Now we're also looking in the eschatology that the fourth deed that we call the Bible, the incarnation of Jesus Christ through Mary into the physical plane, will also have 3 more steps. So there will be 3 further steps of this collaboration between the second Adam and the second Eve and the pure soul of humanity to help the human being on their journey to fulfilling these tasks within the human soul and the moral life. So this is the ongoing consequences. So humanity will help fulfill the consequences of Christ's salvific work, the grace that has been given to us. And these future deeds must go through the transformation of the human being, so that it'll become more and more connected to the transformation of the human being. So we can see how that then now really becomes a really important aspect of these things. So how do we transform the materialistic thinking? Because that is partly how this what Steiner has called the 5th step in the mystery of Golgotha, that the materialistic thoughts since the Copernican age, or since what we would call the age of the industrial revolutions, has dulled the consciousness of the being who carries this pure soul of humanity. And therefore the Christ can't hold himself in the spiritual world, and receives the black sphere of materialism into his being. This is stuff that's not biblical. This is pure, out of Steiner's esoteric insights. But this sacrifice of the extinguished Christ consciousness in the spiritual world is like a second crucifixion for the Christ, and a death by spiritual suffocation of the sort of spirit empty thoughts of humanity. And so Christ and the angelic soul are driven out of the spiritual world. So this is quite a far-reaching thought, that the Christ has been driven out of the spiritual world, but finds a corresponding place within the human consciousness. So this idea of developing Christ consciousness alongside with our human consciousness, Steiner places into the work of the divine feminine, or the Sophia of Christ. So here is where the Sophianic aspect of the biblical stories of the Old and the New Testament, or the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, become really, really more important for us, where we can see this idea that the work of the wisdom within the human soul's capacity to develop the Christ consciousness is part of that second Eve, or the sort of Sophia aspect. So the cooperation between Christ and the human being become more intimate. Knowing this transformed my understanding from a transcendent God who intervened to redeem us from the consequences of sin, to an immanent God who is also the archetype of my humanity, which I must fulfill. So that my Christianity becomes pivotal for the sake of the earth and the cosmos. So that's really part of the eschatology of Steiner, that has some far-reaching thoughts beyond. But how do we fulfill these 3 aspects of salvation, restoration, redemption, and transformation under the guidance of the Christ consciousness, the human consciousness, and we could say the Sophianic consciousness working together? And how does that fulfill itself? Which is the parousia, which is I've called completing the incomplete in part 3 of this chapter, the fulfillment of the Christ impulse. So I'll just read you again a little bit of the definitions there. The noun pleroma, fullness, and the verb plero, to make full or to complete, are the opposite of kenosis, emptying or emptiness, which is fulfilled in the self-emptying of Jesus' own will. We have that famous tract in the Philippians. I won't say that word correctly. So in Paul's letter to the Colossians, the believers have been given fullness, or made complete in Christ. But the fact in their salvation of their salvation does not exclude their contribution to this fullness. Christian service must contribute to realizing the unity of faith and knowledge of the Son of God. So that's from the theological dictionaries around the word pleroma, or fulfillment, or the fullness of Christ. And for Steiner, this fullness of Christ in the human being is the result of the person of faith completing the task of selfless and emptying the ego-focused self, which we've called the imitatio Jesu, followed by the completion of the transformation of the human nature into our Christian self, or the true and universal human, which is the second part of the imitatio Christi. So these are in line with traditional Christology, actually, because Steiner suggests that the theological virtues of faith, love, and hope are the transformation of those protanic virtues. So it's very complex to try and understand that. We'd like to just add maybe one more understanding of this third part. Christ is not only an external agent of redemption, but also the model of the individual's universal humanity. So this is this future archetype of the second Adam. So Steiner sees that a time has come where the role of Christian moral action, and it's time to expand Christian moral spirituality into these realms of personal experience and responsibility. And to be honest, I don't think this really stands out in theology, or Christian community or church theology, or the different denominations would all, I think, at this point be really in complete agreement that we need to fulfill the Christ impulse in taking personal responsibility for our own development and taking responsibility for fixing up, what's happening in the world out of the love that we can find. So I don't think these are kind of way out there. However, what is a little bit way out there is that Steiner talks about how through these deeds, so this whatever you do to the least of your brothers and sisters, I'm going to include environments, rivers, trees, clouds, all the different parts of our whole organism of the earth, and that whatever we do to it, out of the moral impulse. So these impulses out of awe and wonder, out of conscience, out of love, out of hope, these deeds have a source for embodying Christ in us. That's a really important step that Steiner takes here. So when we do these deeds, that love is the true catalyst, and agrees with Paul that is the foremost virtue. That's why he focuses on the transformation in Francis. But I'll just read you what he says here, because this will leave you something to chew on. What is it that has been done for Christ? Deeds that are done out of the Christ impulse, or under the influence of conscience, or under the influence of faith that is in accord with knowledge, these separate themselves out from earthly life. And inasmuch as through moral deeds and attitude one gives something to human beings, one also gives it to the Christ. So whatever you do, you also do to me, is the Matthew 25 question. What does it mean you do to me? And he says, I will express this as a formula. Everything in the way of forces that we create through deeds of faith and trust, through deeds done out of wonder and astonishment, is something that is given over to the Christ ego, and that envelops Christ like a sheath. Because remember, he fell out of the spiritual worlds and now needs a new embodiment to be created for him. So we envelop Christ like a sheath comparable to our astral body. our soul. We build the astral body of the Christ ego impulse through all moral deeds done out of wonder, trust, awe, and faith. In short, through everything that paves the way to supersensible knowledge. Through all these deeds, we also foster love. Through our deeds of love, we build the life body or the etheric body of Christ. And by means of what is created in the world through the impulses of conscience, we build for the Christ impulse that which corresponds to the physical body of the human being. And when the earth eventually reaches its goal, its fulfillment, when human beings understand their moral impulses through which all goodness occurs, then will the Christ impulse, which entered into human evolution like an ego, be liberated. It will be ensheathed in a soul built up through faith, through all deeds of wonder and astonishment, by an etheric body built up through the deeds of love, and by something like a physical body built up through deeds of conscience. Now that's really huge. I mean, the first time I read that, I was like, wow, I have no idea where I do. But this thing of spiritual economy, so our deeds are not limited to human beings, but include all aspects of the world we live in and are therefore a source of our ethical actions on animals, plants, environment. So that's part of the pleroma, how the Christ's work can be fulfilled through the deeds, through the substance created out of love, basically, is where I go with that. And I think I'm going to finish there for now, because that sort of summarizes a lot of that chapter.
Jude, I'm just going to go get a drink of water. I'll be back.
Please do. Okay, so where am I here?
Thanks so much for that, Jude. I think you've given us content for contemplation for years to come.
Yeah, and I got it done in 40 minutes, not an hour.
What I'd really like to do is to open up the conversation to Craig, Raina, and Nicola. I'm not sure if she can hear me. I might have to repeat this when she comes back. But I'd like to put the question to you three especially. We've got so much material going on here. There's so much interesting stuff, and we can't take it all at once. But if I give you the words challenging or difficult or interesting or inspiring, it's like as four key words, and you use one of those words to attach it to something that's been mentioned in this chapter. So there might be something that you found particularly challenging or difficult to understand, or on the other hand, you might have read something and gone, wow, this is interesting and this is inspiring. And I think that's the type of conversation it's really useful to have, because we're all seeing this through our own eyes, and we want to share this together so that it grows. And we don't want to be blind to what might be shortcomings or failure to understand something. So I don't know if you heard what I said there, Nicola. Did you have it on speaker?
No.
Okay, I'll repeat it, and it'll give Craig and Raynand a chance to think of something. So it said using the key words of challenging or difficult when thinking about the content of this chapter, or inspiring and interesting. Take one of those words and then talk about what you've read in this chapter that was either challenging or difficult, or alternatively interesting or inspiring.
Go.
So, Nicola, Craig, Raynand, does anything come to mind? Challenging, difficult, inspiring, or interesting? Or you can pick another adjective. That's fine by me. But it's the sharing aspect and the working with the content that I'm interested in, or we are interested in.
I mean, I think there's a lot of it that resonates with Christology, that's being done everywhere. And he has inspiring ways of talking about it that bring it back to what you're doing and appropriating. The challenging stuff for me is Christ falling out of the spirit world or whatever. You know, I mean, those sorts of metaphysical stories I find quite hard to understand, even,
Yeah.
let alone, you know. Yeah, so it's a funny mixture of those two things, I think, you know.
Yeah, it's sort of so aligned, and yet you have these
Yeah.
little vignettes where you go, hang on.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you have an immediate response to that, Jude? I've got something that's like bubbling away as Nicola asks a really good question there.
Hi there. Is it all right?
Reynard, I thought we'd just to like talk about Nicola's point, and then we'll come to you. Did you want to add something there, Jude, on Nicola's, or can I add something?
You add something, please. I've spoken for 40 minutes already.
First of all, I totally agree with you, Nicola. It's difficult to swallow. So when I work with these type of questions, I'm trying to think, has something similar already happened? So like in the story of Christianity, and for me, the emphasis is on similar, the resemblance aspect. It's not identical, but if we look back at sort of the first 3-4 centuries of Christianity, the way in which there was this recognition in the set of Christ is something divine, this immediate recognition within people who came into contact with the disciples. They didn't need to be convinced by the intellect. It was experiential.
Mm-hmm.
And then that just got cut off there. And we became more dependent on like the authority of Augustine and like the church, etc., etc. But I think we can already in history we can find sort of like something similar to this darkening process, which has become arguably even more acute, because we could then look at compare 16th century or 15th century Christianity to 20th century Christianity, and that's a completely different type of Christianity. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I just think that you get both in every age. That you got people who got the spirit of it all the way through, even when they were like before the Reformation, there were all the, you know, pre-Reformation movements, and you know, you got St. Francis and all that sort of stuff. But you also got people who were very rational, and the rationalists, and you know, even in the 20th century, you get, you know, the charismatics and the Pentecostals, and you get renewal movements. Then you got renewal movements, you know, in the 18th century in the United States and in the UK. So I don't think there's just a progression. I think there's wheat and tares all the way through, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I do think in the
Rain-
19th century, there were more people who thought that the church was going to get better and better. It was going to progress, you know, now that there'd been missionaries
as the body of Christ,
around the world. Schleiermacher, he thought the Christian church was just going to go from strength to strength, you know.
Yeah. I mean, well, the place I would go with that observation of the, you know, the sort of the outside the box pictures is to bring it back to this idea to start with, that is it a possibility for me to think that what I do, Matthew 25, what I do affects Christ, you know, for better or worse. You know, that's a huge thought in itself, that we impact upon the nature of spirit by how we live. And what are the, you know, then the progression is, well, if there's enough of a certain type of thinking and behavior, how would that impact positively, and how would that impact negatively upon Christ? Is it possible to affect him to the detriment of his capacities? I mean, that's a very far-reaching consequence.
Yeah, and that's where I just think it's an interesting idea. I mean, I don't think Christ is somehow or other immune any more than Christ was on earth.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I totally get the idea of impact on Christ, but I think by the time you get to the idea that you might negatively impact Christ, I just think that's, from my understanding, we can't really even go there. It's just
Yeah.
there's so many places we can't go.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I understand that, and yeah, how do we create a possibility of thinking of that? There's these memes. Imagine if I told you. What would you say if I told you? Yeah.
Told me what?
That you could possibly negatively impact on Christ.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are. I mean, you mean Christians or non-Christians?
Well, yeah. I mean, non-Christians probably are. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know what the.
Some people who are doing their absolute best to impact negatively on Christ at the moment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
if the
exactly.
if the church is the body of Christ, then they're definitely doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
And then the antidote of that is to say, well, therefore my deeds of love must become. It's almost like a call to conscience of, well, therefore I need to love more. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Raynon, you wanted to come in. Which word were you going to choose? I'm intrigued.
Okay, I'm still thinking, but okay, you mentioned earlier the word interesting. You know what? We are now in the ending stage of this kind of conversation, but overall, on my end, it's really interesting to me that the more there is a further discussion about this kind of idea, public discourse, or in short, the more there is a progression of science and research, for me, the more I understand the nature of the idea of God, like that, and religion compared to back in the 16th century or 17th century, back during the time of Darwin, when he was still quite hesitant to discuss about his work on evolution because of some religious conflict and all back during the time of Newton, like that. But right now, what I'm thinking is the progression of science and research. It seems to me that it gives more enlightenment, brighter aspect of the theological side, the understanding of the nature of God and Jesus. Now, in this kind of conversation with Nicola, Craig, you, Angus, and Jude as well, through the research of Jude, I'm glad that we tried to explain the biblical area, dimension, theology, Jesus himself, through human perspective, like from our perspective, from the research perspective, rather than the biblical perspective, which is, to be honest, it's really profound if we deal with the biblical text, because I myself, I'm hesitant to interpret the Bible because of, I'm not sure if my interpretation is also correct, because I find that the Bible has its very deep interpretation that sometimes difficult to fit in my mind. So that's my thought for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Craig, did you want to come in? You're still on
Thanks,
mute.
Angus. So, I found stuff both interesting and challenging, right? So it wasn't an either or; it was a both for me. I don't necessarily what Nicholas spoke about with Christ being falling out of the spirit. I don't necessarily find that a challenging concept per se for myself. I find it a challenging concept to talk about with many other people in the world around that. So that's a differentiation I'd like to make on that. But what I find is just looking at these spans of time and talking about these impulses that are now within humanity. I find that a challenge and also interesting, right? So when we're talking about working with these virtues that you know, for example, love, that if we go back to, Francis of Assisi, and then we even look at just the time elapsed between that period and now, we still very much have our training wheels on when it comes to being able to live these virtues in the world. And if we then look forward to, the pictures from Jude's PhD around, we're talking about now to the end of Earth evolution. You've got these huge spans of time to consider, but also at the same time, we've got this immediate consideration around what we think and what we feel and the impact that that has now. So I really wrestle with those two concepts, with this kind of this huge span of time for us still to continue to develop these things, but also the sense of responsibility that comes with what we do now matters as well. That's probably my version of what came to me when I was working through chapter 7.
That's a great way of putting it. I mean, that's what John did at the end of his life, isn't it? He said, what it comes to in the end is love one another.
That's good.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's just absolutely correct. No, it's how we live with each other really is the important bit, isn't it? Yeah.
Hold on. Sorry. I cut you off, Jude. Sorry. Craig earlier mentioned the term progression. So I remember the concept of the term space-time. It seems to me that it requires space-time to understand theology or the idea of God. So I begin to ask questions like, is God itself space-time, or is space-time part of this theological idea? It seems to me, but it's just my thought at the moment, because you mentioned the word progression, which is relevant to space-time.
Yeah.
Perhaps if I share how I found it interesting as well. I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about this chapter was the deeply personal aspect, because if you listen to more orthodox Christians who've had sort of like a taster of Steiner, one of the things that can often be leveled at people who are imbibed in anthroposophy or spiritual sciences, there's this emphasis on this cosmic Christ, but not this ability to bring it down into our own personal experience, which is what you were talking to as well, Wayne, and also you, Greg, with the virtues. So there's this deeply personal aspect is also of great importance to us, to see how ideas can work enrichingly, or in an enriching fashion, in an individual case, in your case, Jude, and then perhaps it will, perhaps it won't resonate with other people, and it brings one of the things it awakens is this question. It's which end do you start with? Your next chapter is called conclusion, at the end, where to begin. I mean, you could have not in academia, I appreciate that, but it's if you were writing for a different audience, you'd have started with the deeply personal aspects for people that are they're battling with Christianity at whatever level it is. And they see somebody who managed to wrestle their way through there and come to something where Christ comes out as this image of something far greater, far more powerful than I was even allowed to imagine within orthodox thinking. And then you get into the weeds with all the details, where people can get bogged down. So it is this interesting, isn't it? Where do we start? Do we start with with the general, with the theoretical, with the theological, or do we start with the personal? Because if we're going, all of us want to continue this journey of allowing Christ, letting Christ live more thoroughly, permeate our souls with its substance. But how do we do that? I mean, that becomes an intimate question for each and every one of us. So yeah, I suppose it just left more questions, but it's interesting how just this can awaken.
Yeah,
It's like
there was a
this backwards and forwards.
yeah. There was a constant tug during the writing. Nicola, who was my supervisor, and Stephen Downs were constantly coaxing me into putting more personal reflection in how I, what this meant for my own Christianity as part of the narrative, as part of, and not just to actually say this thing really got me like this. And I think it may have actually improved if I had to put more in fact. Yeah, but just really to keep it deeply personal is so important. Because that's where everyone wants to start, as you say. That's where you want to start, is in your own experience of things, in your own struggles with things, rather than the philosophy and the metaphysics of it all.
Mm.
I mean, I remember Nicola always came back and said, all this metaphysics, it's specifics around there. This would be so much better if we didn't have to wrestle with all of that. Yeah.
So perhaps that leads to the question, why did you feel the need to do it?
Well, the need for the PhD was, I mean, and Stephen actually said this to me at the end. He said, look, we've spent 5 years talking about this and reading and discussing, and I've known Stephen for many, many years. He was my dean when I did my master's back in Adelaide. And he's had quite a few Christian community and anthroposophical people through the university doing degrees, and he at the end he said, you've opened up Steiner for me. He said, I had Steiner in a corner, and through the discussions you've actually made him accessible to me. And I think that was, for me, that was like a real pat on the back, like, yep, that's what I wanted to do, was for someone for people who may be completely antipathetic towards anything Christian, or who are really deeply schooled in a particular tradition of theology, can approach it and go, wow, if I sit and take this on, I've gotten a good systematic theological academic overview of sort of Steiner. I know it's just sort of pro-Steiner. That's what one of the markers said. This is, typical of a Steiner fan. Not enough criticism, not enough critique that could have gone on there. But yeah, just really saying, yep, this is where he's at. This is how it sits in relationship to a lot of some of the main, the orthodox theology, but also how it fits in with modern exploration. And I think it does that. The whole thing does offer, Nicola always said, well, how does a person of faith read this, So a person of faith and an academic and an antagonist to it might be able to wrestle, or just, work it through and get a good overview, plus some, as you say, interesting and challenging ideas. That was the idea behind it, really, to say it's there now. People can read it.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of other, I mean, in Germany it's different because there's a lot more stuff happening in the German world. I mean, one of my examiners sort of said, this is, we've got to read this in the context of the English-speaking world's theology. And there's not a lot of stuff out there on Steiner's Christology, or that Steiner was even interested in Christian centrality. So I think that's been the deed of it, is to make it available to be read, not to be agreed with, but just to go, here's an overview, and it's, this is how it fits in.
Yeah, and you were particularly good in your talks,
Yeah.
You're very good at simplifying things in spoken presentations.
Yeah, my written work is it's a hard labor.
The full complication of Steiner comes out, but somehow or other you managed to simplify it all.
Yeah. Yes, I'm certainly a better speaker than writer. I definitely agree.
I didn't say that.
No,
Richard.
I say that. I say that. Sorry. I struggle with the written word. It's really hard.
I have a comment. Actually, I just returned from the Philippines, and I think I finished my data collection there for almost a year. And throughout my stay there, I was also invited in different places, specifically in the seminary, the Catholic seminary for priesthood like that, and in the Catholic schools as well. And I started to do lectures on Steiner and the philosophy, anthroposophy, as a lens complementing the Catholic doctrine as well. And it seems to me that, to be honest, I don't really find significant conflict there. It's building up, lensing from my Catholic and from that Christian Catholic community. I think seems things are complementing.
Very much so. Very much so.
Steiner's philosophy could be used as a lens to understand Christianity as well. Building up Christianity, something like that.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, that's great you got that opportunity, Raynand. Yeah.
I'm happy that I became part of this kind of conversation, even though it's virtual, because it's a very good discussion, and I look forward as well that this kind of discussion will be continued, but because I think there's a necessity for public to understand as well the reality, and this.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd like to develop what you're saying there, Rain, and it's really interesting. Jeff and I, a friend of mine in the States, we commented a video by Jonathan Pajot, very influential, it's like in more orthodox thinking circles. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Nicola. And Paul Kingsnorth, and it was a particularly interesting conversation because Paul Kingsnorth, he has had like a certain amount of contact with Steiner, and he says, it's like it's like an article that we cite. He says that, but no Orthodox Christian can accept Steiner's theology. And one of the things that I find so interesting and resonates really with what Raynand is saying and his experiences in the seminaries there is that if people understand their orthodoxy more thoroughly, they actually begin to find there is a deep resonance. It's like the truths that like live within orthodoxy. It's like they find, I'm talking now from my own personal experience, a far deeper foundation. Like they stand on that rock. They're not standing on stone. They're not blown away by modern physics. They're not blown away by modern vicissitudes. They are anchored in a way that they become a foundation on which to build.
Kingsnorth interacting with
Jonathan Pajot. He has quite a large. There's something called, there's a person called John Vervaeke who discusses with lots of people something that's called the meaning crisis. And John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pajot, they all they're a stream in Canada who've become immensely influential, like especially on YouTube. I don't know, they've written stuff, but they have like large followings on YouTube because people are interested in this, like how do you resolve what they've come to call the meaning crisis. And then each one of these voices has gone off in their own directions. Vervaeke in one, and Peterson, who's probably the most famous of the three, and then Pajot is a third voice there. But he has quite a large following online and really does try to grapple. Clearly has a deep knowledge of Christianity and Christian culture, Christian history. But it is so interesting to hear them. So like on one part, Jude and myself could sort of like fit, as people who understand Steiner's like quite who've had a lot of time working with Steiner. At a certain level, we can feel a deep resonance. It's like the love of Christ that is there. But then their reasons for dismissing Steiner becomes like, come on, guys, you haven't even bothered to try to understand what he's trying to say. Because if you do it, you would realize that is deeply in harmony. It resonates thoroughly with like this image of Christ that you're talking about. So thanks for raising that, Raynand. It's really interesting.
Okay, well, I'm wondering if we've sort of covered enough of the interests and challenges for this particular chapter. If we should just wind it up there for this chapter and see how we continue or not into the future. I mean, we've got projects on the brew for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like you're pretty busy, Jude, with this course you're doing.
Sorry. Yeah, I will be. Yeah. So we'll see where we go.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to go through this.
Yeah, look, thanks for sticking with it. I much appreciate it. I mean, I thought it'd be quicker than, I thought it'd be a few weeks and we'd have it covered. But I think it's been almost a year and it's been really rewarding for me to revisit it and re-articulate it.
I think it was better to do it slowly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really productive. Yeah.
I
can also sorry, go on. You first, Raynand.
I mean, I also learned a lot from the very beginning up to right now of this kind of conversation. It seems that I refreshed myself with my chapter 2, my literature about anthroposophy.
Good.
I got a lot of things now to bring to my thesis if I go back to my.
Oh, that's great. Wonderful.
Besides, because of Steiner's philosophy, I find myself better. I understand better my Christianity. So not only the scientific thing, but explaining God or Christ through layman's terms, something like that.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Jude, can I just remind, I think did you send everyone a copy of the email for our upcoming virtues work? I just wanted to sort of flag that because that's coming up the 21st of March, and it is quite relevant with some of the stuff we've been talking about tonight, which is working with a list of 12 virtues that Steiner gave in his book, Guidance and Esoteric Training. Each of those virtues line up with a zodiac sign. And Jude and I will be going into our second year offering that course, which is really sort of combining science, if that makes sense, where we're looking at using some techniques that are out of the Heart Math Institute, where we're able to sort of measure heart rhythm patterns and what happens with feelings and emotions. So really trying to deepen our understanding of the virtues, connect with them spiritually, practically how do we live them in the world. And Jude's done an amazing job reimagining the zodiac, which is a huge piece of work as well, where he gives a contemplation more on an esoteric poem around the zodiac. So again, just flagging that if you feel comfortable, if you could share that out with your networks, that'd be amazing, because that starts on the 21st of March with Aries and devotion. We'll go again on that particular date.
Good. Thanks, Craig. Okay. Well, thank you. Angus, you said you wanted to.
Also, your work is beginning to raise some interesting voices here in Scandinavia as well.
Oh, interesting.
The Norwegians are interested in what you're going to say, and I mean, this is something in process. But it's the work you've done is also invaluable for those who are actually more deeply into anthroposophy as well, in an English, non-German speaking world, if I put it like that.
Yeah. Look, it's been an interesting one because, how do you publish after do you write another book? And I've sort of taken this opportunity to explore getting a larger exposure through speaking rather than writing chapters into books, but that may come yet. But I think it is worth having it out on the public forum.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
for
been
Thank
wonderful
you.
working with you guys.
Yeah. Cheers.
Okay.
Thanks so much for your support and
Yeah.
interest.
Take care,
Okay,
everyone.
bye.
Bye.